Dan Haug currently serves as Acting State Budget Director for the Office of Administration, the Division of Budget and Planning. After completing his time as State Budget Director, Dan will return to his position as Director of the Division of Administrative Services at the Missouri Department of Mental Health, where he is responsible for planning, implementing, and managing department-wide administrative functions, including budget and accounting. As a member of the department's senior leadership team, Haug has played a key role in making improvements to programs benefiting Missourians with behavioral and developmental challenges. Previously, Haug served as an economist, budget analyst, and then director of the Senate Appropriations Committee staff. From 1995 to 2002, Haug was an economist and budget analyst at the Office of Administration's Division of Budget and Planning. Haug has a master's degree in economics from Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville, 1995. It's my pleasure at this time to present Dan Haug, Acting State Budget Director.
All right, good morning. As you heard, I'm sort of on loan from the Department of Mental Health. When I go back there, I think it's going to be more for counseling and that than actually to work after doing this job. But it's been fun. I've enjoyed it. Let's see if I can figure out how to work the slides here. Well, oh, not that one. We'll get a little instruction here. Yeah. One of my, oh, that one, okay. There we go. I was going up and down instead of right and left. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the economy, the state budget, state revenues, and do the status and future outlook. We'll start with the good news. We're not Illinois or Kansas, so that's the good news. Actually, Missouri is doing pretty well. I think I've got about 15 minutes to go over this, so I'm going to go over the first couple of parts of my presentation sort of quickly, but then we'll take a little more time to talk about the budget and especially the future outlook. I think that's probably what you guys are most interested in. So we're going to start here with growth in Missouri personal income and wages and salaries. You can see we've rebounded from the Great Recession there. Both personal income and wage and salaries are growing in that 3 to 5% range, which is pretty good. We feel good about that. Our unemployment rate has come down significantly since the Great Recession and is below the national average. Our employment is up, and our growth is, while it's cooled off a little this last couple of quarters, is still doing pretty well on the employment side. And then you can see our taxable sales have really bounced back from the Great Recession, and we're doing pretty well there. And then inflation, as it is in the U.S., is pretty low and under control here in Missouri. So basically what I would say about the economy is the Missouri economy is doing pretty well. It didn't really show up in our tax collections this last fiscal year. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But overall, I think the fundamentals of the Missouri economy are doing well. We're seeing growth in employment, growth in wages and salaries. So those are all good things that hopefully will help underpin the budget going forward and lead to relatively strong revenue growth going forward. Just to give you a little idea of where we spend our money, the total budget is $27 billion. This is the general revenue budget. This is the funding that we get from income tax, sales tax. This is really where the state government has the most control. Our total budget is about $27 billion. It shakes out as about $9 billion general revenue, $9 billion other state funds, and $9 billion federal funds is roughly our mix in the budget. You can see that elementary and secondary education comes in at about 35% of the total spending. The social services, mental health areas come in at about 31%, at a little bit less than $3 billion. Then you have higher ed at a little bit less than $1 billion, and then you've got sort of everything else there. If you look at our total spending, the total $27 billion budget, you see that the human services areas become the biggest area, because most of the human service areas, that's our Medicaid program. We get a 60-40 generally federal match on that, so the federal funds really bulk up total spending in that area. You can see that the elementary and secondary education spending is $5.9 billion. We're at about $1.3 billion on higher ed, and then you've got all the other areas in there that we spend money on. If we look at the DESE budget, this is what was appropriated in 2016. You can see the vast majority of that, almost 90%, goes into the foundation formula. You've got nothing else is really over 3 or 4 or 5%. Special education comes in at almost 7%, about $219 million. This is what is appropriated for 2017. You can see that there's about we went from about $2.8 billion to $2.9 billion in the formula. Transportation's up, although that increase has been restricted. We'll talk about that in a little bit. That's some of the, unfortunately, the bad news we're going to have to talk about a little bit later. But you can see that the total appropriation went to $3.3 billion. Some of the highlights as far as what we did in the DESE budget is for 2017, had a $70 million increase in the foundation formula, bringing that total to $3.3 billion. That's an increase of about $388 million since the beginning of Governor Nixon's administration in that, which, considering some of the economic difficulties we had during the term, it's pretty impressive that we were able to increase the formula by that much. Also in the 2017 budget, we've been able to increase $31 million from the school district trust fund for schools, a $24 million increase in federal funds for school food services, and then a $21 million increase for early childhood special education. I know this is a DESE conference, but I thought I'd throw in higher ed here just so you can see what else is going on within the education budget of the state. 2016, we spent about $933 million on higher ed, the vast majority of that going to the four-year institutions. You can see spent about $77 million on scholarships and about $136 million on our two-year institutions. For 2017, that increases to $997 million, with much of that increase going to the four-year and the two-year institutions. You can see that the highlights of what we were able to do in the 2017 budget for higher ed, we had a $37 million increase for the four- and two-year institutions. Along with that increase, those institutions agreed to a no tuition increase. Missouri has been leading the nation in the lowest tuition increases in higher ed, so we were happy to be able to continue that. We were able to increase some of the scholarships funding, including Bright Flight, A+, Access. All right, let's talk a little bit about the budget. 2016, this is where we collected our revenues. You can see about 70% of Missouri's revenues come from individual income tax. About 23% of it come from sales. Corporate's about 3%. Everything else is just sort of little cats and dogs in there. But you can see that we are very reliant on both individual income tax and sales tax. Next chart is a little bit of a depressing chart here. This shows the orange line shows where we are. So for 2016, we collected a little bit less than $8.8 billion. The darker line shows if we would have had trend growth from the Great Recession on, where we would be. And trend growth is about 3.5%, so it's not really that high a number to hit. But if we would have averaged 3.5% over that time period, we'd be at about $10.5 billion versus the 8.8. So that shows you that we have not really recovered totally from the Great Recession. We are slightly above the actual dollar amounts that we collected back in 2008. But if you factor in what normal growth would have been, we are still significantly below. And I think that speaks to some of the budget issues we've had over the last 6 or 7 years. And while our revenues have sort of grown at a somewhat tepid pace here over the last few years, things like the cost of medical care and other things have continued to increase. And so that's certainly put a squeeze on the budget going forward. You look at Missouri general revenue as a percent of personal income. This sort of shows the tax burdens that is put on Missourians from general revenue, from those individual income tax and sales tax. You can see in the late 90s, we were collecting around 4% of everybody's personal income for taxes. Due to tax cuts, tax credits, other things that have been enacted over the last 20 years or so, we're bouncing around now in the low to mid 3% of everybody's personal income that we're collecting to run state government on. And then next slide here is tax credits. I've put the general revenue collections on there just to give you an idea of sort of how it's grown compared to tax credits. Tax credits certainly grew pretty substantially in the late 2000s. Have tailed off a little bit, but tax credits are still averaging somewhere between $500 and $600 million of that come off the top of our taxes. To give you an idea, you know, that's just a little bit less than we're spending on, say, the Department of Corrections. So tax credits are a very significant part of our budget. All right, our future outlook here. And I'm sure this is what you guys are really, really interested in. So in 2015, we collected 8.8% increase in our general revenue collections. For 2016, we only had growth of 0.9%. Just to give you a little bit more history on this, in 2014, we were actually down 1% in our collections. In 2013, we were up 10%, so we've been on this roller coaster of collections, and that makes it very difficult to budget, very difficult to forecast. Hopefully 2017 is an up year based on this pattern, but that's difficult to count on, and so that's why, one of the reasons why we have the restrictions in place that we do. You can see for 2016, our individual income tax was up 3%. Our sales tax was up 3.7%, and our net corporate tax collections were down 35.6%. Let me talk about this just for a second. When I look at our collection information, the two things I look at to sort of see how the economy are doing is the individual income tax withholding. That's what we take out of everybody's check every 2 weeks. Our withholding was up 4.6% for fiscal year 2016. That's very strong. That tells me that, one, more people are working, and two, those people that are working are getting wage increases. So those are two very good things. That makes me very optimistic about our economy. You look at sales tax being up 3.7% in the low inflation environment we're in right now. That's very strong growth. That's really good. So that makes up about 90% of our collections that are doing very good. Unfortunately, we were down 35% in net corporate. That dollar-wise is about $150 million reduction in the amount of taxes we collected from corporations from 2016 to 2015. And on the next slide here, you'll see we had 0.9% growth. Our forecast was 2.8% growth. The difference between 0.9 and 2.8% growth is about $170 million. Corporate tax was off about $150 million. So you can see that while the underlying economy was doing very well in Missouri, because of corporate taxes being down, our revenues were down, and that's what's led to the restrictions that we've put in place. We had originally forecast for the 2017 budget that we would grow 4.1% above that 2.8% level. Well, we've come in well below that. As you see there in the second bullet, we would need 6.1% growth to fund the budget as passed. That's why we put in about $115 million of restrictions. With the restrictions in place, we need around 5% growth to fund it without any other restrictions having to go into the place at this time. So we are monitoring that. Right now, July was a good month. We're up 7%. Unfortunately, July is our smallest month. There's no really major due dates in July, so it's hard to draw any trends from July. But at least we're starting off in a pretty good manner. So we are going to monitor the situation closely. The other thing I'm concerned about is there are about $60 million of tax cuts that have been vetoed that may be taken up in the veto session in September. If those vetoes are overridden, that's $60 million more of restrictions we're going to need to put into place to make sure the budget's balanced, because those tax cuts would go into effect for this current fiscal year. So those are some of the things we're looking at as far as if we need to do more restrictions or if we can release the current restrictions. I will tell you that it was very difficult to decide what we restricted. What we ended up doing in that $115 million is almost everything that is in restriction right now is either a brand new program or an increase to an existing program. And while a lot of those new programs are really good things, and while a lot of those increases are needed, we felt like that was better than taking services away from Missourians that are already receiving services. We also felt like that would protect the priorities of this state, which include the foundation formula. There's no restriction on the foundation formula. So money going to classrooms was not restricted. Money going to higher ed so that we could continue with the tuition freeze for our students in Missouri was not restricted. Funding for our most vulnerable Missourians, Missourians with developmental disabilities and behavioral health issues, was able to not be restricted. So while this $115 million in restrictions is painful, and I know there's some good programs in there that were restricted, we think that these restrictions do the least harm to Missourians, protect the priorities of Missourians. And one of the things, when I started, I said, the good news is we're not Kansas or Illinois. One of the reasons we're different than Kansas and Illinois is that when we see that we have financial issues, we take them head on immediately. Illinois, basically what they do is they just don't pay their bills. They don't actually go in and cut their budget anywhere and get it back into balance. They're 6, 8 a year behind paying their providers. They're not paying their schools. They're not paying their universities. So one of the things that we feel like we do, and unfortunately we've had to do a number of times over these last few years, is that we take these financial challenges head on. We do the most responsible management of it that we can. And so I think, again, like I said, that's how we're different. That's why we're one of only 7 states. Actually, it's 6 now. Alaska was just downgraded. One of only 6 states that has a AAA bond rating from all 3 rating agencies. They look at how the states run. They know that we're going to be responsible in the way that we deal with our finances. So, future outlook. I am somewhat optimistic about the economy in Missouri. I am an economist by trade, which is maybe a good thing, maybe not. But I do think the fundamentals of the Missouri economy are doing well. I think we've got more people working. We're seeing wages increase in Missouri. People are buying things. Our sales tax is up. So I do think there's some things to be optimistic about. We do have some tax cuts that are on the way. Senate Bill 509 lowers the individual income tax rate. That originally was supposed to go into effect January 1st, 2017. There's a trigger on there. It only goes into effect if the state collected $150 million more in revenue than they did the previous year. We only collected $77 million more in revenue from 2016 to 2015, so it will not go into effect then. Certainly hopeful that revenues will grow enough that it'll go into effect in January 1st, 2018. It's a 5-year phase-in with that trigger for each year, so it could take a little bit longer. But fully phased in, that's about a $600 million reduction in revenues to general revenue. So that is going to make the state really have to look at its priorities, really decide where it's going to spend its money. It's going to make for some difficult decisions over the next several years. Some of the uncertainty out there is sort of what's going on internationally. Will we see some significant aftershocks from the Brexit? Puerto Rico has got some problems. But again, I'm relatively optimistic about Missouri's economy. As we talked about, Senate Bill 509 went into effect. One of the reasons that the corporate income tax was down so much is that the corporate franchise tax was phased out. There was also a corporate change in how corporations could allocate their profits from one state to another, and so we think that contributed to corporate income tax being down so much. And then there were about $12 million of tax cuts that are going to go into effect in 2017 that will affect our revenues. I know lottery and riverboat are a big part of the funding for K through 12 education. Lottery actually had a really good year. We budgeted $299 million. We actually collected $309 million. That was a 14% growth. General Assembly budgeted about $311 million in lottery. So if lottery stays flat, grows slightly, we should hit that. We'll see. It's so dependent on these big jackpots and those kind of things. Riverboat continues to struggle a little bit. We need about 1.7% growth to hit the budgeted amount for 2017. We had 1% growth last year, so Riverboat is continuing to grow slowly. It doesn't seem like Missourians are going to the casinos as much as we thought. So some of the potential bright spots, Medicaid expansion would certainly bring in a lot of money for the budget. The federal fix for internet sales could be up to $150, $200 million. And then if we continue to grow our economy. So that's it for my presentation, and thank you guys.